After the anniversary, I found an unexpected gift in our car, but it wasn't for me. Mark and Laura had just celebrated their 5th wedding anniversary. They had always seemed like the perfect couple, overcoming minor disagreements and supporting each other through life's ups and downs. Laura wasn't just Mark's wife. She was his best friend and partner in every sense. They'd even started planning to have a child in the near future. But lately, Mark had noticed subtle changes in Laura. She often seemed tired, occasionally gave strange responses to his questions, and spent her evenings glued to her phone, seemingly unaware of his presence. Though it worried him, Mark brushed off these thoughts, assuming it was just work-related stress. A few days after their anniversary celebration, Mark headed out for a routine trip to the store. As he got into their car, he noticed something unusual, a small gift bag on the passenger seat. His chest tightened with unease. A gift? He didn't remember Laura mentioning anything about buying him a present after their anniversary. Why hadn't she given it to him earlier? Mark glanced at Laura, who was sitting beside him, her gaze fixed downward. She looked lost in thought, which only added to his suspicion. "Did you buy this for me?" he asked, keeping his tone light but unable to hide the concern in his voice. Laura's eyes darted toward the bag, her expression shifting instantly. She seemed confused, almost caught off guard, and a faint shadow of embarrassment flickered across her face. She quickly reached for the bag, clutching it tightly. "No, it's probably just something from the store. I must have forgotten to put it away earlier," she said hurriedly, avoiding his eyes. Mark's suspicions deepened. Laura was clearly nervous. This wasn't like her. She rarely reacted so strongly to simple questions. "Why are you so tense? Is there something you're not telling me?" he pressed, his gaze locking onto hers. Laura tried to laugh it off, but the sound was forced. She rolled down the car window, taking a deep breath as if to steady herself. Her movements were stiff, her words unconvincing. "It's nothing, really. Let's just go," she said, her voice lacking its usual warmth. Mark wasn't ready to let it go. Her discomfort only fueled his growing doubts. Over the past few weeks, he'd felt a strange distance between them, an unspoken tension that hung in the air. Determined to uncover the truth, Mark decided he needed to investigate further. When they returned home, Mark waited until he was alone to open the gift bag. Inside, he found an old compact disc labeled Laura and Friends. Curious, Mark inserted the disc into his computer. What he saw made his heart race. The screen filled with footage from parties he didn't recognize. At first, the video seemed harmless, Laura laughing and enjoying herself with friends. But as the images progressed, Mark noticed she wasn't alone. Other men appeared in the photos and videos, their interactions with Laura feeling far too intimate for his comfort. His chest tightened as he watched her smiling and laughing with these men. It wasn't just the images, it was the way she looked at them, the carefree energy he hadn't seen from her in a long time. Shutting the laptop, Mark's mind raced with questions. Why hadn't she told him about these moments? Who were these people? And why did it feel like this gift was more than a coincidence? Later that evening, as Mark sat quietly, trying to process his thoughts, he noticed something on the kitchen counter. Laura's phone. Its screen lit up, displaying a new message. The text wasn't from anyone he recognized. "See you at 7. Don't forget to bring what we talked about." Mark's pulse quickened. The message wasn't meant for him, and it raised a million questions. Who was this person? And what were they planning? That night, unable to suppress his growing unease, Mark waited until Laura was asleep. With trembling hands, he unlocked her phone and began scrolling through her messages. Most of the conversations seemed mundane, filled with work-related topics. But then he found a thread that made his blood run cold. "Are you home? Did you take everything? I told you this time we'd be more careful." Mark stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just innocent banter. It was a clue, a piece of a puzzle he hadn't even realized he was trying to solve. What was Laura hiding? And who was she hiding it with? Mark was stunned. He couldn't believe his eyes. The message on Laura's phone clearly didn't come from anyone familiar to her, and the words carried an eerie mix of mystery and veiled menace he couldn't quite comprehend. Yet, the unease it stirred in him was undeniable. His thoughts spiraled. What if Laura was seeing someone else? What if this wasn't the first time she betrayed him? The cryptic phrasing of the messages felt insincere, as if they were part of something larger, something he couldn't grasp but instinctively knew was serious. When Laura woke up, she had no idea that Mark already knew more than she'd ever imagined. Confronting her outright wasn't an option. Admitting he had looked at her phone would only give her a reason to distrust him. Instead, Mark decided to observe, to gather evidence without raising alarms. He tried to stay calm. It was his wife, his partner, after all. But the uneasiness gnawed at him. Something was wrong, and his instincts wouldn't let it go. Over the following days, Mark watched her closely. Every glance, every gesture, every move. He noticed how distant she seemed, avoiding intimacy and retreating into her own world. This only deepened his suspicions. With every passing day, it felt more and more like Laura was hiding something. Mark resolved to wait for her to come clean. He didn't want to accuse her without proof, but the weight of his doubts was growing. One evening, Laura mentioned a gathering with friends and casually invited him to join. Mark declined, saying he needed to work. But deep down, he felt that this was the moment he'd been waiting for. When Laura left the house, Mark couldn't sit still. He knew what he had to do. For the first time in this unfolding drama, he made a definitive move. He followed her. Driving behind her car, he tried to steady his nerves. Each stoplight felt like a test of his resolve, each delay feeding his tension. His heart raced, but his determination held firm. He didn't have solid evidence, only a gut feeling that demanded answers. Laura's behavior seemed normal as she left the house. She moved with ease, hopping into her car without a glance in his direction. Nothing seemed off, no signs of stress or anxiety. Yet Mark couldn't shake the memory of that message. This was no longer just suspicion. It was a need to confirm whether his instincts were right or if he was imagining things. He trailed her car carefully, maintaining a safe distance to avoid detection. Laura's route seemed random. She changed directions several times, like someone trying to lose a tail. Or maybe she was just driving without a second thought. Mark couldn't tell, but his nerves were on edge. Finally, she stopped at a familiar cafe. Mark parked at a discreet distance, hidden from view but close enough to watch. Laura stepped out, looking completely ordinary in her casual evening dress, as if this were just another night out with friends. She went inside, greeted a small group of people, and exchanged pleasantries. Nothing about her demeanor suggested anything unusual. Mark watched closely, scrutinizing every interaction. Some men were part of the group, but their exchanges were polite, not intimate. Laura seemed relaxed, even carefree. For a moment, Mark doubted himself. Was he overthinking everything? Was his paranoia clouding reality? He considered leaving. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe everything was fine, and he was letting his imagination run wild. But then he remembered the message, its strange tone, its subtle threat. That memory kept him rooted in place. Minutes passed. Laura laughed and chatted with the group, her behavior unremarkable. Mark's anxiety wavered between relief and lingering doubt. He checked his watch, debating whether to stay or go. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Was he projecting his own insecurities onto her? Or was this gut feeling his only chance to uncover the truth? Mark decided to wait just a little longer. Something told him the night wasn't over yet. His heart pounded as he tried to steady his breathing, every passing second a battle between hope and fear. If Laura wasn't hiding anything, why did he feel like the ground was about to give way beneath him? A few minutes later, 2 more people entered the cafe, unfamiliar men, neither of whom seemed suspicious or ominous. They simply chatted with Laura, laughed, and sipped their coffee. Laura appeared completely at ease, as though nothing out of the ordinary was happening, just a casual meeting of friends. Mark kept convincing himself that his anxiety was unwarranted. He decided to stay in the car no longer. His doubts and nerves were overwhelming. He revved up his engine, made a turn, and drove home. Nothing unusual had happened. It all seemed like a regular evening out. When Mark returned home, guilt and doubt began to weigh heavily on him. What if he was truly overreacting? What if it was all in his head? He lay down on the bed, replaying everything he had seen in his mind. Laura came home about half an hour later, smiling, completely unaware that Mark had been following her. She carried a small gift bag, but even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her habits, her mannerisms, they were the same as always, but his mind couldn't find clarity. Laura seemed normal, but he couldn't rid himself of the nagging suspicion that she was hiding something. That night, even as he tried to sleep, the inexplicable feeling gnawed at Mark. Eventually, he decided that perhaps he was just imagining things. Still, he couldn't shake it. The memory of her glance when she walked into the house. Her eyes didn't seem as open. Maybe he'd never noticed before, but now everything felt different. Her behavior seemed too routine, almost rehearsed, but he knew her well enough to sense when she wasn't being completely honest. A new idea began to form in his mind. He decided he needed more proof, more than just following her. He had to know what she was doing when he wasn't around. What if she really was hiding something? Despite trying to calm himself, he resolved to approach things differently next time. The next morning, Mark woke up earlier than usual, determined not to let his doubts consume him. Laura was still asleep beside him, looking peaceful and carefree. Yet, a new thought took hold of him. What did she do when he wasn't home? Perhaps that was the real question he needed to answer. Quietly, Mark got out of bed, dressed, and left the room. His mind was made up. He would check her phone. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but what other option did he have? He needed to know the truth. Laura had a peculiar habit of leaving her phone on the kitchen counter, even when she stepped into another room. This gave Mark an opportunity. Standing in the kitchen, he paused for a moment, questioning what exactly he was looking for. This felt wrong, and he knew it, but at this point, it didn't matter. He felt justified in finding out the truth. Taking a deep breath, he picked up her phone and quietly began scrolling. First, he checked her messages. Nothing suspicious. Everything seemed fine. But the deeper he looked, the more uneasy he felt. Going through her call history, he noticed several numbers he didn't recognize. Laura had a lot of acquaintances, but for some reason, these contacts weren't saved in her phone. His chest tightened as his anxiety grew. And then, he stumbled upon something that genuinely shocked him. One of the messages Laura had received just a few hours earlier was from someone he didn't know. It was short, only a few words, but its meaning was far deeper than it seemed. Last night was amazing, as always. Can't wait to see you this weekend. It was like a punch to the gut. Mark couldn't believe his eyes. Now, after reading those words, the reality hit him. This was more than just a casual conversation. Laura had been on a date, and it seemed like there was something more between them. Maybe it was just flirtation, but this message didn't feel random. Why hadn't she ever mentioned this person to him? How many more messages like this had she received? Clutching the phone tightly, Mark began breathing heavily. His heart pounded in his chest as despair mixed with anger and pain. It felt like his world was falling apart. Could Laura, his beloved Laura, be cheating on him? He had been so close to the truth, but now it seemed undeniable. The decision was made. Mark knew he had to tread carefully. His mind raced with thoughts of how he should respond to this revelation, but he also knew he couldn't act out of anger. He needed to uncover more before deciding what to do next. Mark sat at the table, his head in his hands, unable to shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. What had he missed? How had he been so blind to the signs? This wasn't just paranoia. He genuinely felt that Laura had started to change. The events of the previous day left him with a vague sense of unease. Without concrete evidence of her betrayal, Mark resolved to take the next step, to set up hidden surveillance. Cameras in their house. Mark decided to install them after failing to find enough answers by checking Laura's phone. Now it was clear to him. To uncover the truth, he would need to dig deeper. The cameras weren't too conspicuous. He placed them in spots where she was unlikely to notice them. In the bathroom, the kitchen, near the bedroom door. He felt no shame for his actions. He simply wanted proof. Meanwhile, Laura had gone to spend the night at a friend's house, which was not unusual for her. They often spent time together, and Mark didn't question her words, though his gut told him something was off. The next morning, when Laura came home, Mark didn't immediately notice the details. But something felt strange. She was wearing a new dress he didn't remember seeing before. It could have been a gift from her friend, but he didn't like how she looked. So fresh, as if she had just returned from an important event. She walked past him without saying much and quickly headed to the bathroom, as though trying to avoid his gaze. Mark couldn't help but notice how she tried to hide her purse, as if it contained something he wasn't meant to see. As she shut the bathroom door, he couldn't resist the urge to look inside her bag. He opened it and saw something that made his heart race. Inside was new, very provocative lingerie, black stockings, a garter belt, and an elegant set of panties and a bra. The lingerie didn't seem like it was meant for him. He wasn't sure who it was for, but unsettling thoughts began to flood his mind. Calming himself was almost impossible. He sat on the edge of the bed, unable to process what he had just seen. Of course, he didn't confront Laura about his suspicions. She probably had no idea he had looked into her bag. Mark decided to wait. For now, there was nothing to say, and he didn't have solid proof of her betrayal, though he felt it might only be a matter of time. When Laura came out of the bathroom, she looked calm, as if nothing had happened. She even smiled at him. She didn't share any details about her night with her friend, which made Mark even more uneasy. He chose not to ask questions. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to mask his anxiety. "Yeah, just a bit tired," Laura replied, lying down on the bed. "We had a lot to talk about and had some fun. I'm just exhausted from all the chatter." Her words sounded strained to Mark, as if she was trying to hide something. He knew her well enough to sense that her tiredness wasn't just from talking. Her behavior seemed too carefully planned, and he couldn't shake the look she gave him as she rushed past earlier. It felt as though she was avoiding his eyes. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he watched her face, observing her every move, but too hesitant to ask any questions. His heart beat faster, overwhelmed by a growing sense of betrayal. "I'll head to the other room. You can sleep here," Mark said. "I don't want to disturb you." Laura quietly nodded, settling back into bed. Mark left the room, closing the door behind him. He heard her breathing even out as she fell asleep. She was calm, but he felt no peace. For some reason, this new chapter of his suspicions felt like the beginning of something important. Would this be the moment he uncovered the truth? Or was he just overthinking everything? Mark realized he couldn't endure the uncertainty any longer. The events of the past few days had grown more and more intense, and every little gesture and action from Laura made his heart race. He couldn't just sit back and wait for something to happen or for her to offer an explanation. He needed to know the truth. The only thing left to do was to talk to her friend. The next morning, Mark called Laura's friend, Svetlana. He tried to sound calm, though tension was bubbling inside him. His voice was measured but firm enough not to raise her suspicions. "Hi, Svetlana. It's Mark. Can you tell me anything about last night?" he asked, sounding casual but probing for her side of the story. Svetlana sighed at first, not understanding why he was asking, but after sensing something in his tone, she decided to answer honestly. "Oh, hey, Mark. Well, everything was fine. Laura and I just hung out and chatted. Honestly, we stayed up pretty late, but eventually, she said she had to head home. She left around midnight, and I went to bed," Svetlana replied, sounding calm and pouring water on his anxious thoughts. But Mark caught something in her tone, something that made him doubt her honesty. He couldn't explain why, but it felt like Svetlana was holding something back, as though there was a part of the story she was deliberately leaving out. But Laura didn't get home until morning. "She seemed really tired," Mark said, blurting it out without thinking. "Are you sure you don't know where she went after she left your place?" Svetlana went quiet for a moment, clearly considering her response. "I don't know what to tell you. Laura has always been like that. You know her. She likes to do things her way. But I can definitely say that after she left, I didn't hear anything from her," Svetlana said, almost trying to convince him that everything was just as usual. Mark felt like someone had thrown him a thin thread of truth, and now he was trying to pull it further. His doubts were growing. Svetlana was probably hiding something, but that wasn't the main issue. What mattered was that Laura had left on her own, and when she came back in the morning, she was tired but didn't really explain anything specific. That was enough for him to take action. The day Laura stayed at home, Mark decided not to let her fall into a questionable comfort zone. He didn't tell her he was going anywhere. He simply left her alone. At that moment, he knew it was the best decision. He left for work, leaving his surveillance camera on, observing her movements at home. Mark didn't know what exactly might happen, but he was ready to find out the truth. The cameras in the house captured everything, from the slightest movements to when Laura went in and out of rooms. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was changing, and every little movement seemed significant. He watched through the cameras, hoping to find some clue. The room was quiet, and it seemed like nothing was happening, but Mark couldn't take his eyes off the screen. Laura was home, acting like nothing had happened, sitting at the table, pulling out her phone, silently typing a message to someone. His heart tightened with every step she took, and he felt the adrenaline filling his body. Why was she so calm? And what was she hiding? Then he noticed something. Laura sat on the couch, letting her hair down, and began listening to music through her headphones. She was so relaxed, as if nothing had happened. But Mark understood that it was just an appearance. At the same time, as he watched her through the cameras, his suspicion grew. Maybe she just needed to rest after a long night? Maybe everything was exactly as she said? But then, another scene appeared on the screen. Laura grabbed her phone and quietly went into the bathroom. She left the door slightly ajar, and Mark saw her dialing a number on her phone. Quietly, emotionlessly, no rush. His heart nearly jumped out of his chest. He could hear her voice, very quietly, but he was certain she was talking to someone she knew. But who? Now he was sure of it. Laura was hiding something, and he needed more evidence to understand who else was in her life. Mark sat at the table, unable to take his eyes off the screen. He kept replaying the footage from the cameras. Every movement she made, every word on the phone. But he didn't know if he would ever get the full truth. Maybe this was just the beginning of what he had to uncover. His heart raced as the camera recorded another movement. Laura came out of the bathroom, looking more nervous than usual. She wasn't as relaxed as before, and Mark noticed. There was a certain anxiety in her behavior that made him feel like something was missing. A few minutes later, Laura, still holding her phone, dialed a number and left the house. Mark didn't hesitate. He started the car and followed her. He didn't know where she was going, but he felt it was important. He moved slowly down the street, trying to remain unnoticed, watching her every move through the window. Laura stopped at a small cafe and went inside. Mark couldn't believe his eyes. This wasn't a coincidence. His wife, who was supposed to stay at home, was meeting someone in this cozy place. He decided not to rush and stayed in the car, watching through the window. Half an hour later, Laura came out of the cafe with a man who wasn't her husband. He hugged her by the shoulders, and Mark felt bitterness filling his heart. He couldn't hold back the tears that filled his eyes. This moment seemed like the end of the world. He couldn't believe that all of this was happening to him. It felt like time had stopped. He sat in the car, unsure of what to do. Laura walked with this man to the car, and Mark stayed in his, watching, not wanting to interfere because he didn't know what to do next. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a random betrayal. Laura had been hiding something from him for a long time, and now, seeing it with his own eyes, his heart could no longer endure this uncertainty. Mark stayed in the car until he realized he couldn't take this tension any longer. He couldn't keep watching her without doing something. He needed an answer, and he had to find a way to get it. But right now, his feelings mixed with what he had seen and what he had to do next. Mark's gaze became cold and determined. He decided this moment would mark the beginning of a new chapter for him. And even if everything was broken, he wouldn't allow himself to stay deceived anymore. He had to take control of the situation. Mark sat in the car, not taking his eyes off the cafe doors, through which Laura and this man had exited. He couldn't just leave it like this. All these months of uncertainty, questions, suspicions, and now, he was dealing with facts. All that was left for him was to get the answers. He took a deep breath, feeling how anger and disappointment mixed in his chest. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a game he'd been forced to play. Laura turned out to be someone he didn't know. Mark stepped on the gas and followed their car. Laura and the stranger were heading toward her house, and he knew this moment couldn't be missed. He continued, "I don't know what to tell you. Laura has always been like this. You know her. She likes to do things her way. But I can definitely say that after she left, I didn't hear anything from her," she said, as if trying to convince him that everything was just as usual. Mark felt as though someone had thrown him a thin thread of truth, and he was now trying to pull it further. His doubts grew. Svetlana was probably hiding something, but that wasn't the main issue. What mattered was that Laura had left on her own, and when she came back in the morning, she was tired but hadn't really explained anything more specific. That was enough for him to start taking action. That day, when Laura stayed home, Mark decided not to let her stay in the questionable comfort zone. He didn't tell her he was going anywhere. He just left her alone. In that moment, he understood it was the best decision. He went to work, leaving his surveillance cameras on at home, watching her every move. Mark didn't know what exactly would happen, but he was ready to uncover the truth. The cameras in the house recorded everything, from the smallest movements to the times Laura went in and out of rooms. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was changing, and each movement she made seemed significant. He watched through the cameras, hoping to find any clues. The room was silent, and it seemed like nothing was happening, but Mark couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. Laura was at home, as if nothing had happened, sitting at the table, quietly typing a message to someone on her phone. His heart tightened with every step she took, and he felt the adrenaline start to fill his body. Why was she so calm? What was she hiding? At that moment, he noticed Laura sitting on the couch, letting her hair down, and starting to listen to music with headphones. She acted so freely and relaxed, as if nothing was wrong, but Mark knew it was just a facade. As he watched her through the cameras, his suspicions grew. Maybe she just needed to rest after a tough night? Maybe everything was truly as she had said? But then something else appeared on the screen. Laura grabbed her phone and quietly went into the bathroom. She left the door slightly open, and Mark saw her dial a number on her phone. Quietly, emotionlessly, no rush. His heart nearly jumped out of his chest. He could only hear her voice, very softly, but he was sure she was talking to someone she knew. But who? Now, he knew for sure. Laura was hiding something, and he needed more evidence to figure out who else was in her life. Mark sat at the table, unable to look away from the screen. He replayed the footage over and over. Every movement she made, every word on her phone. But he didn't know if he would ever get the full truth. Maybe this was only the beginning of what he'd have to learn. Mark felt his heart race as the camera picked up new movement. Laura came out of the bathroom looking more nervous than usual. She wasn't as relaxed as she had been earlier, and Mark noticed that. There was an anxiousness in her behavior that made him feel something was missing. A few minutes later, still holding her phone, Laura dialed a number and left the house. Without hesitation, Mark started his car and followed her. He didn't know where she was going, but he felt it was important. He moved slowly down the street, trying to remain unnoticed, watching her movements through the window. Laura stopped at a small cafe and went inside. Mark couldn't believe his eyes. This wasn't a coincidence. His wife, who was supposed to stay home, was meeting someone at this cozy place. He decided not to rush and stayed in the car, watching through the window. Half an hour later, Laura came out of the cafe with a man who wasn't her husband. He put his arm around her shoulder, and Mark felt a bitter sting in his heart. He couldn't hold back the tears that welled up in his eyes. This moment felt like the end of the world. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. It felt as though time had stopped. He sat in the car, not knowing what to do. Laura went to the car with this man, and Mark stayed behind, watching, unsure of what to do next. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just an accidental affair. Laura had been hiding something from him for a long time, and now, seeing it with his own eyes, his heart couldn't take this uncertainty anymore. Mark stayed in the car until he realized he could no longer bear the tension. He couldn't keep watching her without taking action. He needed answers, and he had to find a way to get them. But right now, his feelings were tangled with what he had seen and what he needed to do next. Mark's gaze grew cold and determined. He decided that this moment would mark the beginning of a new phase for him. And even if everything was shattered, he would no longer allow himself to live in deceit. He had to take control of the situation. Mark sat in the car, his eyes locked on the cafe doors through which Laura and the man had exited. He couldn't just let this go. All these months of uncertainty, questions, suspicions, and now he was dealing with facts. All that was left was to get the answers. He took a deep breath, feeling anger and disappointment mix in his chest. This wasn't just an affair. It was a game that he had been forced to play. Laura had turned out to be someone he didn't know. Mark stepped on the gas and followed their car. Laura and the stranger were heading to her house, and he knew he couldn't miss this moment. He kept following them. "Now I understand," Mark said, finally looking up. "You want to say that I'm your salvation? You want me to save you from him?" Laura sighed, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "I don't know what to do, Mark. I've lost control. I've lost you, but I don't know how to fix it." Mark felt all the emotions surge in his chest. He didn't know what to feel, anger or sadness. All these months of suspicion, deceit, now had an explanation. But that explanation was even more complicated than the betrayal itself. Mark sat on the edge of the couch, looking at Laura, who stood before him. Her eyes were filled with tears, but he couldn't feel compassion. He was broken, deceived, and stunned by what was happening. He was waiting for an explanation, but with every word she spoke, he realized he was only going to get more lost in this chaos. "I don't know if I can forgive this," Mark said, his voice cold, but inside, his heart was aching. "But I want to know everything. You have to explain to me, who were you with, why did this happen, and why didn't you tell me earlier?" Laura lowered her head as if trying to find the strength within herself to respond. She sighed, collecting her thoughts, and began to speak. "It didn't start the way you think, Mark." Her voice was quiet, but there was something resolute in it. "I met him at work when you were so busy. At first, we just talked, but then it grew into something more. He understood me, supported me when I was upset about your absence. I felt like he was giving me what I hadn't had in a long time." Mark sat, listening to her, but each word she spoke added more pain. He thought about all the years of their marriage, about how they had faced problems together, and now he felt completely alone in his world of deception. "So you're saying that I was too busy with work to notice that you were looking for support in another man?" His voice became sharp, and he struggled to hold back from exploding. Laura couldn't meet his gaze. She didn't answer, only lowered her head even further, as if trying to hide from his questions. "When did it become serious?" Mark leaned forward, his hands clenching into fists. "When did you decide that your relationship with me no longer mattered? And why didn't you tell me earlier?" Laura trembled, her lips quivering with emotion. She looked as though all her strength had left her, but she knew she had to tell the truth, even if it would destroy everything. "I don't know what happened, Mark," she started, her voice trembling. "I know this is wrong, but I couldn't stop. He gave me what I so desperately needed. I thought it was just temporary, that I could come back to you. But then I started realizing that this wasn't just betrayal. It was another world, one where I lost myself." Mark sat in silence, listening to her, and he felt the pain and anger overwhelm him. He couldn't understand how all of this had happened. How could the person he loved so easily break their relationship, their promises? "You still haven't answered my question, Laura." His voice became even colder. "Who were you with? And why?" Laura sighed, then looked at him with a heavy expression on her face. "It was Din. He's the man I was seeing. He works with me in the marketing department. He was very attentive, and I started feeling like he understood me better than you." Mark felt like the words had been taken from him. He couldn't believe this was happening. "Din?" he repeated. "You're telling me that you cheated on me with a colleague? And didn't even try to talk to me about what was going on in our lives?" Laura nodded. "Yes, I know this all sounds awful, but I got confused. I couldn't decide what I wanted. And when it became serious, I couldn't go back." Mark felt a sense of loss and pain breaking him. He didn't know if he would ever be able to forgive her, but he was determined to find out everything so he could understand what had happened. "Now you have to tell me everything," he said again. "You promised to be honest with me. I want to know what happened, why you did this. I want to know everything." Laura was silent for a few seconds, then began to speak. "At first, I was just flattered by Din's attention. He was so kind to me, interested in me, supported my ideas. And then, when we had a few meetings after work, I started feeling like he was my support. I couldn't go home and just be a regular wife. I started looking for something more than just being his wife. And then, one evening, he asked me if I wanted to spend more time with him. And everything happened so quickly that I didn't even have time to think. Mark sat, listening to her words, and inside, everything was tearing apart. He understood that this wasn't just betrayal. It was a whole series of choices Laura had made, and now she was trying to justify her actions. But why didn't you stop? Mark asked, unable to hold back. You could have come back to me. You could have changed everything. Why did you stay with him when you saw how it was destroying me? Laura lowered her head again, tears filling her eyes. I don't know, Mark. I was just afraid of losing everything I had, even if it meant living in deceit. I didn't know how to go back once all of this happened. Mark sat there, feeling his heart fill with pain and disappointment. His life, his love, everything was now in ruins. He didn't know if he could ever find a way to forgive her, but one thing was clear. Everything had changed. And now he had to make a decision that would determine his future. You need to go back to him, he said finally. That was your choice, and I can't be part of this anymore. I don't know if we'll ever be together again, but right now, I just want to know what happened and why. Laura sighed softly, feeling her world falling apart. She knew she had lost everything, and now her path was clear, forward, without Mark. Mark left the apartment, leaving Laura standing there, stunned and alone. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he couldn't stay in the world of lies they had built together. Mark stepped out of the apartment, his heart pounding, as if trying to break free from his chest. He didn't want to remain in the world where he was deceived, where love and trust had vanished with every word Laura had spoken. But despite the pain and disappointment, he knew he couldn't just leave without getting the final answers. He threw on his coat, focused his gaze on the night city, and stepped out into the street. His steps were determined, resolute, but inside he felt the emptiness gradually filling his soul. He knew he had to understand why everything had happened the way it did, and why Laura made those choices. He returned to his car and drove to a place that reminded him of a time when his life was different. It felt like each mile took him further from home, but closer to the truth. He decided that he needed to talk to Dan. That was his next step, to learn more about this man who had changed everything. Mark parked his car near the cafe where Laura had met Dan. He stepped out, glanced around, trying to remain unnoticed. This wasn't just about revenge or anger. He needed to figure out what was happening to understand why his life had changed so drastically, and maybe even to decide what to do next. He entered the cafe and immediately spotted the man sitting in the corner, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper. It was Dan. He didn't look menacing or dangerous, but he was the man who had broken his family. Mark walked up to him and sat down across from him. "We need to talk," Mark said with a serious expression. Dan looked up, surprised, and stared at him. "About what?" "About your relationship with my wife," Mark replied, trying to stay calm. His voice was firm, but inside he felt anger bubbling up. Dan set the newspaper down and paused for a few seconds. Then his expression grew serious, and he tilted his head. "You want to know why it happened?" "Exactly," Mark responded. "You didn't just betray me. You destroyed my life, and now I have the right to know the truth." Dan sighed and looked at Mark as if assessing his reaction. Then he nodded and began to speak. "I knew you were busy, but I couldn't leave Laura in that state. She was always open, smart, and I saw how hard it was for her. And I couldn't just leave her alone. Of course, I didn't mean to destroy your relationship, but over time, feelings developed between us." Mark listened to him, and his heart hurt with each word. He couldn't understand how this man, who had been so close to him, could act this way with his wife. But what hurt even more was that Laura had allowed it. "You didn't just let this happen," Mark said. "You made it happen. And now you want an apology?" "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Mark," Dan replied, his voice calm, without anger or fear. "I just want you to understand why it happened. I couldn't leave her the way she was. And I don't regret what happened between us." Mark felt his blood boil with rage. "You don't regret it? You took everything from me. I did everything for her. I worked late, trying to provide for us. And all I got in return was betrayal." Dan looked at him with understanding. "I'm not to blame for how things turned out with you and Laura. I was just there when she needed someone." Mark fell silent, feeling his anger reach a boiling point. He couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, threw one last look at Dan, and left the cafe. He needed time to process everything he had just heard. Mark walked towards the park, where it seemed the only peace he could find existed. His thoughts were a tangled mess in his head. He tried to understand how he was supposed to live from now on. What should he do? Which path was the right one? He sat on a bench, pulled out his phone, and texted Laura. "We need to talk," he typed, then hit send. His hands were trembling, but he knew he couldn't put off this conversation any longer. He needed to hear everything from her. A few minutes later, he received a reply. "Where are you? I want to see you." "I'm waiting for you in the park," Mark texted back. Laura appeared a few minutes later, looking exhausted, but her eyes remained as closed off from emotions as always. She sat down beside him without saying a word. They sat in silence for a few minutes until Mark decided to speak. "Now I understand everything. I know who you really are, Laura." His voice was firm, but inside, a storm of emotions was raging. "And I don't know if I can forgive you anymore." "Mark," Laura started, but he interrupted her. "You've already said it all. Now it's my choice, and I know what I need to do next." He stood up and walked away, leaving her sitting on the bench. He didn't have all the answers yet, but now he was ready to move forward, even if it meant doing it alone. And even though his heart was filled with pain, he understood that this moment would mark the beginning of his new life. Now, he would choose his path on his own. Mark stood by the window of his new office, watching the dawn. He felt how a sense of control replaced the inner emptiness. Sometimes, pain and betrayal give us the opportunity to rethink our lives, and Mark understood this from his own experience. All those weeks after learning about Laura's betrayal, he hadn't just been mourning the pain. He had been plotting revenge. This was his path to restore justice, and he had no intention of stopping. It all started when Mark decided to gather all the necessary information. He didn't just stop at what he had seen that night in the cafe when Laura walked out with the stranger. That was only the beginning. He found out where Dan worked, her colleague from the office. It turned out they didn't just work together, but also spent time after work, having lunch and staying late at the office. This gave him grounds to act. Mark watched them for a few days. He knew that after work, they often went to a cafe nearby, where they spent hours drinking coffee and talking, and it was there that he decided to take control of the situation. But his revenge wouldn't be crude or spontaneous. He had to create a situation that would sting both Laura and Dan. The next day, when Laura and Dan went to the cafe after work, Mark also headed there. He brought along a few friends from the advertising business, and together they organized a small ad campaign. They placed job ads for Laura's company on several large banners hanging on nearby buildings and on social media. Job openings at Laura's company. Have fun after work. Anything is possible. The ad slogans read. They sent this to every possible account, including Laura's. All her followers, friends, and colleagues, even Dan, saw the ads. When Laura saw it, her reaction was immediate. She contacted Mark. Naturally, she had no idea it was his idea. "Have you lost your mind? What are these rumors? How could you do this?" she texted, and Mark could feel the fear in her words that had always intrigued him. She knew this was just the beginning. The next step was an even more direct intervention. Mark gained access to some internal documents from the company where Laura and Dan worked. Among them, he found details of a project they had been working on together for the last few months. Using these documents, Mark created fake emails and sent them to their bosses. The emails described unauthorized changes in the project, including their unprofessional behavior at work, insinuations that they were pushing deadlines, raising unnecessary discussion points, and not fulfilling their duties. A day later, calls from the administration started coming into the office. Laura and Dan were called in for a conversation with the management. They didn't understand what had happened and why they were being called. Mark wasn't in that office, but he saw the result. Laura nervously texted Dan, discussing the situation. Dan tried to calm her down, but Mark knew this was just one step in his revenge. And here came the moment when Mark decided to finish his game. He invited Laura to dinner, claiming it was to discuss their future. She was surprised, but agreed, unaware that what awaited her was not just a simple reconciliation. Laura arrived at the meeting place, and to her surprise, she saw Mark with a few of his friends. They were all sitting at the table, showing no sympathy or acknowledgement towards her. She sat down, trying to act normally, but her nerves couldn't hold up. "What's all this gossip?" she asked, noticing documents with her photos on the table. Mark paused, looked at her, and replied without taking his eyes off hers. "This is just the beginning. You have no idea how far I can go. You chose this man, and now you'll have to face the consequences." Laura, bewildered, asked, "What do you want from me?" Mark looked at her with a cold smile and placed several papers in front of her. "You want me to forgive you? How about this? Do you know why Dan doesn't want to associate his name with you? Because he got his promotion ticket, and you, Laura, are just a stepping stone. This isn't me. This is your cruel game." Dan, whom she had seen as an ally, realized that Mark had already taken control of the entire situation. He left the restaurant without even looking at her. Laura sat there, her mind racing, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Mark didn't leave Laura any chance for an explanation. He sent several videos and documents revealing her actions at the company and how she had tried to manipulate the situation. All her colleagues saw this, and even though Laura tried to deny everything, she had no support. Eventually, it came to the point where Laura was forced to leave the company. She could no longer work at the same office, and her reputation was ruined. Mark's revenge had been completed. He left Laura with no chance to avoid the consequences of her actions. And at the moment when Mark was leaving the restaurant, he felt a sense of relief. All his actions, even though they seemed excessive, had a purpose. He had escalated the situation to a point where Laura could never turn back. After Laura was forced to leave her job and all her manipulations were exposed, she realized that her life had been turned upside down. All her connections were broken, her reputation shattered, and there were no longer any people who supported her. She sat at home, trying to deal with the aftermath of her actions, when she received a message from Mark. "We need to talk. I want to know if we have a chance." Laura flinched at those words, although she knew this was her last chance. She immediately responded, without hesitation, "Mark, I made a mistake. Can you give me another chance? I want to fix everything." Mark read her message, and although the pain and hurt still lingered in his heart, he didn't rush to respond. He sat at the table, thinking for a long time about what to do next. But everything he felt for Laura had already changed. Right after her betrayal, he promised himself that he would never let her manipulate him again. And now, as she was asking for forgiveness again, he knew that his decision had already been made. A few days later, Laura showed up at his door. She stood at the threshold, her face filled with sadness and remorse, her eyes brimming with tears. But Mark didn't allow himself to feel any pity for her. "Mark, please don't push me away. I'm ready to change. I understand how much I hurt you." Her voice trembled with emotion. "I love you. I'm ready to start over." Mark looked at her with cold calm. His heart no longer fluttered at her words as it once did. He knew that time had healed his wounds, and there was no longer any place for her in his life. He had already realized that he deserved better. "Laura," he said softly but firmly, "you've already lost me. Not just my trust, but any possibility of coming back into my life. I can't forgive you. You've destroyed everything." She silently looked at him, not knowing what to say. Her hopes of reconciliation were melting away like snow in the sun. She tried to find the right words, but every step she took seemed hopeless. "I don't want to change anything anymore, Laura. I've started a new life, and there's no place for you in it. I can't bring you back because it would be a mistake again. This is no longer your mission. I'm not the one to forgive you." Laura felt every word strike her hopes dead. She knew he was right, but she couldn't accept that she had lost him forever. All her manipulations, all her attempts to hide behind lies, everything was crumbling before her eyes, and now she was left with an empty heart. Mark, for his part, was calm. He didn't feel any anger or hatred, just a certain peace and confidence in the correctness of his decision. He knew he had made the right choice. In the following weeks, Laura tried several more times to contact Mark, but he ignored her. All her attempts to revive their relationship ended only in further disappointment. And then, when Laura had almost lost hope, Mark completely changed his life. He started seeing another woman, Catherine, a colleague from another company. She was completely different, gentle, caring, without tricks and deceit. She took care of him in ways Laura never could. With her, Mark felt free, happy, and loved. She accepted him as he was and never questioned his actions. They spent time together, laughed, and made plans for the future, without any tension or fear of betrayal. Mark felt that his life had become brighter, and he no longer wanted to go back to the old ways. Laura remained in his past, and although she tried to come back, Mark knew it was just an attempt to trap him in the dark trap she had created for him. Now, with his heart open to new possibilities, he had no intention of going back. And while Laura remained alone, her world falling apart, Mark began a new chapter of his life. Clean, without lies and pain, with a woman who valued him as he deserved. He no longer felt any regret when he thought about Laura. She was part of the past he had left behind. And with every new step he took in his new life, he felt the pain from betrayal slowly disappear, giving way to true happiness.